Well, I'm going to present this presentation in two parts. The first is going to be facts about mental illness, statistics about mental illness, and stigma that is associated with it. The second part is going to be my story. And I'm going to be telling you the story of my living with the mental illness in order to let you know not just my story, but what it's like for other people who have a mental illness, what it's like for them. And in hopes to reduce some stigma and to provide you with a better understanding of mental illness and understand what it's like for people who live with one. Here we go. Mental illness is a physical illness of the brain. And you're going to hear me say this several times because people do not think about it being a physical illness. Mental illness has stigma. Diabetes doesn't have stigma. And this is no different. It affects the thoughts and feelings and perceptions and behaviors of the person who has it. And again, and I'm going to keep saying it, it's a physical illness of the brain, just like diabetes is a physical illness. There's many types of mental illness. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to name just a few of the common ones. Anxiety disorder, personality disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and some are minor, some are severe. Anxiety disorder and depression are probably the most common. I copied some statistics down from a publication from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, which was called Mental Health by the Numbers. And I'm going to read these statistics. I think you'll be surprised. 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness each year, and 1 in 25 adults experience serious mental illness each year. 1 in 6 U.S. youth age 6 to 17 experience mental health disorders each year. 1 in 6 youth age 6 to 17. 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by age 14 and 75 by age 24. And what I mean by lifetime mental illnesses, it's like what I have, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and many others. There is another statistic that I want to tell you, but I want to warn you, it is shocking to hear. I was shocked when I heard it, and it takes a lot to shock me when it comes to mental health. What is the statistic? Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 34, age 10 to 34 children, mental illness definitely has a genetic component to it. It runs in families. And this data points to just how common mental illness is in the world. Although it's so common, there has always been stigma associated with it. And what do I mean by stigma? From the point of view of someone who is doing the stigmatizing, it is being done under false, negative, and even cruel way from some other person, and being very judgmental, and they don't. People doing the stigmatizing do not know what they're talking about. In the case where you're the person who's being stigmatized, like when I've been stigmatized, well, I feel dirty and ashamed. How could I have such a disease? So I'm hoping that this presentation will reduce some stigma, if there is any. A few examples. When the news media labels a possible suspect as mentally ill, when mental illness has absolutely nothing to do with what the crime was, that's stigma. Television shows often say cruel things about mental illness. And although I love Law and Order, Lenny, if any of you have ever watched it, I have heard him say, of course as the script, cruel things about people who have mental illness. If you were to refer to somebody with a mental illness as being crazy or nuts, that's stigma. And those are two words that are used. If on a personal level, for example, you were to tell somebody to just snap out of it, try harder, and you will be fine, that would be showing little regard for them. And unfortunately, in families, and my family was one, people with mental illness do hear things like that. I heard it. Although understanding of mental illness is becoming better than it was, stigma still presents a big challenge. And I'm, again, hoping that my presentation will help reduce some stigma. Now, on to my story. I am a wife of 35 years. I'm a mother of a 52-year-old son who is married and is a documentary filmmaker, and who you will hear me and Frank brag about every single time that there is to do it. I also have a 50-year-old daughter who's an attorney, and I have a 19-year-old granddaughter who's a junior in college at Wellesley, and a 16-year-old son grandson who's in high school. I'm also an auntie and a friend, and a member now of Northern Hills Synagogue, which I'm very glad to be. And I have bipolar Disorder. I'm a retired clinical social worker slash psychotherapist and a retired mediator for separation and divorce and senior mediation. And that was a real hoot, dealing with divorcing couples. And I had my own clinical and mediation practice in Maryland before we moved to Florida and before we just moved here to Ohio. We're here about a little over 3 months. I enjoy reading, I enjoy opera, I like classical music, and having recently moved from Maryland to Ohio, I'm going to be doing volunteer work with NAMI, the National Association on Mental Illness. And I hope to be doing volunteer work when the time comes with Northern Hills Synagogue. And I enjoy being here with Frank's family, who has been wonderful support, just being able to understand what I have and accepting me for what I am. But let me tell you how I got here. In 1978, having been married for many years, but not having been diagnosed with bipolar at that point. As I mentioned earlier, again, bipolar disorder is an illness of the brain. It affects thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and behaviors of the person that has them. It's caused by electrical impulses and chemicals in the brain. There are shifts in moods, severe shifts in moods, from depression to hypomania to mania. As a professional, I recognize now that in retrospect, mental illness was actually rampant in my entire family, although they did not accept mine. It was actually a relief to get the depression, not the depression. It was a relief to get the diagnosis. I always knew there was something wrong with me. As an adolescent, I was either happy or crying. And my mother always told me, but nobody took me to a doctor or anything. Not knowing what was going on was terrible. However, I'm happy now that I was diagnosed and that I now, with mental health team, a psychiatrist and a psychologist, I was able to get help. When I was first diagnosed, my ex-husband was appalled and refused to let me take medication. He said his wife wasn't going to take that stuff. He came from a family where you poo-pooed being sick. You never told anybody if you didn't feel well, and much less if you had a mental illness. My God, that was a real shanda. And my parents were also, they were ashamed and of the diagnosis and never accepted my diagnosis. It made me feel dirty, shameful, and less than a real person. Not unlike the feeling of others who have mental illness. Many who have other mental illnesses. I have felt stigma at one level or another all through my life. Now, I would like to tell you what my illness has felt like. I think of myself as a pie, an apple pie. I have 9 pieces that I like, but there is one very dark, moldy type piece. There used to also be a light piece, but that is no more. I don't have that. The light piece was the manic piece. And I liked the manic piece, but Frank didn't, because when you're manic, you have what they call pressured speech, and you talk and talk and talk and go from one subject to another, and you participate in either funny behavior, but often it can be dangerous behavior. But I miss the fun part. I never knew which piece of the pie was going to surface. I would find it very exhausting when I was manic, going from not sleeping to 2 days in a row of rearranging my furniture, until I felt, and again, I'm going to say a word that is going to be hard to hear. I went from doing all of that exhaustion to feeling suicidal. The depression may be only 1/10 a piece of the pie but when it's present, it just engulfs all of me like a tsunami. It's a very powerful piece of the pie. When I'm depressed, I find myself going down and down and down and down into my deep, dark tunnel until there's no light. Picture yourself in a cave and the guide says to you, I'm going to turn off the light so that you can experience what real darkness is like. That's what it's like. I feel as though I'm suffocating and I can't breathe. I feel helpless. I feel out of control. It feels as though someone is just taking over my body. The only way I see out, and here's that word again, is suicide. And again, this is other people with mental illnesses. This is similar stories. Fortunately, as you can see, my suicide attempts were never successful. I'm here giving this presentation. I have always had excellent psychologists and psychiatrists, but not all people with mental illnesses do. I've been lucky, I've had the best, but there are those that don't get the best. And then there's those who won't even go to a psychiatrist or psychologist for either because of the stigma or they just don't want to. But if you have a mental illness or you know anybody who does, that's a must. During one depressive episode, just to show you what good psychologists I had, my psychologist came over at 11 o'clock at night because Frank was concerned about me. I cannot stress enough, again, I know I keep saying it, but how important a good mental health team is and family support. But let me tell you about the light part of the pie, my fun part. I no longer have that peace, but boy, it was super. Even though it could be exhausting, but it was worth it. Once I had an appointment with my psychiatrist after dinner. So I went to my closet, I looked through my clothes, took out what I thought was a really sexy dress, but it needed a belt. But that was okay, because I'd go on the way to the appointment, I'd stop at Woodward and Lothrop and buy the belt, and that would do it. So I proceeded to put on lots of makeup, of which I hardly ever wore makeup. And I went to his office, and I proceeded to try to seduce him. And in case you're interested, I didn't succeed. Another time I went to buy linens on sale because they were on sale. And I picked out 4 beautiful, beautiful comforters and 4 beautiful sets of sheets and went up to the cashier. And she says to me, "Are you sure you want to buy these, miss? Because it's $2,000. And my 7-year-old daughter was with me, and she said, "Daddy's going to be very angry." I didn't know what was wrong with this salesperson. I was manic. I got what I wanted. I bought it. I thought she was crazy, and I didn't know why my daughter was saying it. So I bought it, and I went home, and just so my husband couldn't ask me to return it, I washed the comforters, and I washed the sheets and put them on the beds. I was very proud. I did a good job. But my daughter was right. When my ex came home, he was furious, absolutely furious. Meanwhile, when I was stable, I guess I should say my ex was never supportive, supportive of me. And so meanwhile, when I was stable on medication, I divorced him. Fortunately, I met Frank, and we married several years later. He had become my best friend and my sole supporter, in addition, of course, to my psychiatrist and my psychologist. Again, they're a must. Frank has been through my depression, my suicide attempts, and my manic attacks, and he's still here. I cannot stress enough how important family is. It can be the difference between life and death. When I married Frank, I began working on a county hotline, and I found out that, gee, I was able to help people. And everybody on that shift was a social worker. So I decided I wanted to be a social worker. But before I go on, I should tell you something ironic. My very first telephone call on the hotline was a gentleman who said he had a gun to his head and he was going to kill himself. And it was my job to keep talking to him until the director of the hotline called the police. Until the police got there, they traced the call. And they couldn't understand how I was so calm. But I was calm because I knew how the fellow felt. And I think I knew what kind of tone of voice I should use with him. And he lived till the police did get there. So one day, since I wanted to be a social worker, after work, Frank took me to community college. And before I knew it, I was signed up for their mental health program. To this day, I don't know how I got signed up so quickly. Frank did it. And it was a good thing. I was 45 years old. That was the beginning of a new life for me. I graduated with honors in spite of several depressions episodes. Ironically enough, the professor or the classmates, nobody supported me when I came back after I had my depressions. They didn't know what to say to me. That was in the mental health field. So there was stigma all over. I went on to get my bachelor's and my MSW, and I graduated at the age of 51. I was in and out of psychiatric facilities while in college. During one stay, my internship supervisor said, "Marci, if I'd known you had bipolar disorder, I would not have taken you on as an intern." So I was devastated and afraid that she wasn't going to let me graduate. I asked her, did that mean she wasn't going to let me graduate? And she said, "What kind of person do you think I am? Of course you can graduate." She herself didn't even know she was stigmatizing me. I completed community college with honors, undergraduate with cum laude, and a graduate school of social work with an MSW degree. After working several years in different agencies, that was when I opened up my own therapy practice. And I wrote multiple articles on mental health and gave many presentations on mental health, like I'm doing today, except they were to local professional audiences. I also trained as a mediator for separation and divorce and senior mediation. I now hope to restart a book that I started years ago, and that was entitled Surviving Bipolar Disorder. I have been able to accomplish the above because of my mental health teams and Frank. However, without medication, I would not have been able to have accomplished any of this. And the medications, unfortunately, come with lots of side effects. I had side effects with my kidneys and neurological, and I'm tired all the time. And the very worst was I gained weight. And trying to lose weight is hard. So but I have stayed with it. If you want to be well, you have to. And it's so important that people with mental illness understand this, because you can have a good life, even with the ups and downs. Stigma has played a big part in Frank's and my life. And because of this stigma, we never told anybody that I had bipolar disorder. We just kept it to it. We have kept it to ourselves, and Frank has had the burden on him when things were going bad. And that's why we decided to move to Ohio to be near his sister and her family. They're very understanding of it. And we got to the point we need support. Everybody needs support. And hopefully people get the support, and maybe this talk will help, that much younger than I am. I'm 78, and we're just getting this support from family. In a weird way, bipolar has made me the person that I am. I'm more determined to have a good life, regardless of anything. And to give back. It's very important to me to give back to the mental health field, because I consider myself lucky that I have been able to come as far as I have. I will be doing volunteer work with NAMI. They have a lot of programs. I'm only going to mention a couple. One is in our own voice, and that's where presenters present their story about their mental illness journey, just like I'm doing today. So I will be doing that. And they have a support group for people who have the mental illness, obviously. And then they have one for families, and I think for spouses. They have a lot. I'm not quite into them yet. I'm just starting. But I do know that they've just started, when it's possible to do it, going into the schools and talking to children about mental illness, which is really important. And I know that Rabbi Schapper has spoken with Julia, haven't you? Yeah. I'm also hoping to do some, when the time comes, some volunteer work with Northern Hills Synagogue. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope that some of what I said stays and leads to a better understanding of mental illness. Thank you.
Marci, thank you so much for that very powerful presentation, for sharing a story that I know can be difficult both to share and to hear. But thank you again. We have a couple questions. One question is very relevant to the time that we're living in right now. How has the pandemic affected your mental health, both with your bipolar, but also with just in general with the feeling of depression, which I know that many of us here are struggling with the pandemic. So how has it affected you?
Well, actually, it hasn't affected me too much. We have been able to see his sister and brother-in-law, which has helped. I haven't felt isolated. But the truth is, I've been busy with my psychiatrist and my psychologist, so that doesn't answer. I guess the bottom line is, at this point, other things are affecting me. So the pandemic, I don't know.
Side effects.
What?
The side effects.
Oh, side effects, but that has nothing to do with the pandemic. I'm going through some changes with my medications now, so that's kind of taken over anything else. It's hard to think about other things when I'm going through that. That doesn't answer anybody's question, I know.
I think it answers it really well, which is your point about having a strong support system. You know, without that support system, it sounds like the pandemic may have been much more influential in your, everything. But having that support system was really has really been something that has maybe protected you.
Yes, it's I guess.
We have another question as well, and the question is autism at any point on the spectrum considered a mental illness?
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that. I suspect that it probably is, but I'm not, I don't know that much about autism. I don't know. I can look it up and tell you, Rabbi.
Great response. So we will, maybe we can send out a bit of an email or something that has the answer to that question on it. Another question is, how has the move, and I think what this means is the move from Florida to Ohio, how has that move affected you and your mental illness?
Actually, it's as far as my mood has been better since we moved, and it's mainly because we have support, and I see the family, I see his sister, whereas in Florida, forget it. One time we had just moved here and it was Passover, and I was depressed because here we are alone and we couldn't see his sister or brother. And the woman who does her hair, who now does my hair, brought over a Seder plate and a meal for us. In Florida, forget it. But in Florida, forget it, because everybody where we lived were seniors, so everybody had their own problems and didn't necessarily bother with if you had something wrong. So up here, the move has been wonderful. I'm sorry that we didn't do this before. It's terrific. Even with my now having to go changes in medication, I'm not as upset as I normally would be about it, because they're here. So I hope that answers it.
I think so. So once again, the support system becomes really important.
Support system, there's no change. You got to have a support system. You really, and if you don't.
So another question that has come up is about your family. You mentioned how your family has been really dismissive or even antagonistic against your mental illness. And the question is, has your family become more accepting of your illness?
Well, they're dead now. But they died not accepting my illness. And the funny thing was with my mother, it's her family that, in fact, Frank was able to trace it back, and it was through my grandmother. My mother would never, she said nobody in her family had a mental illness, and I had to remind her that her daughter did. So they never. Mm-mm.
Sorry to hear that.
Frank's family, I mean, his sister and brother-in-law, they're the first ones that have been accepting of what I have.
I think there's a point, if I can just jump in very quickly, which is that the support group doesn't just have to be from your family, but it can be from the people that you choose. So,
right. Yes.
So here at Northern Hills, and I speak for myself and the other rabbis on staff, you know, if you're looking for a support group, if you're looking for just someone to talk to or someone to even help you through, you know, contacting other people to support you, you know, finding a therapist or a psychiatrist, please reach out to us. We're here in order to be your support when it might feel like there's nobody else.
You're right, because my synagogue didn't support me, and I belonged there for a long time. So this is a whole new ball game in Ohio for us.
Another question that has come up is another question about the move from Florida to Ohio. Did you have to change who was in your mental health team? And if so, what was that like? Were there any challenges to having your support team change?
Yes, in fact, I thought that was going to be terrible, but fortunately, I had hooked up with NAMI. I had called them before I ever moved because I knew that I wanted to be part of NAMI. And the woman who was the program director got me a psychologist, and the psychologist got me a psychiatrist within, I think, one or 2 weeks. And I'm lucky because they're wonderful. You know, they seem to be wonderful anyhow at this point. And so that was, it's almost like too good to be true. Everything's happening. But we were lucky, and it was because of NAMI. Julia, the program director at NAMI, tried to get me into the Lindner Center, but they didn't have any openings. So, but if it wasn't for her, it would have been a real challenge, and I would have had a problem. So.
That's wonderful. So NAMI is a resource that we can all turn to.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
And if needed, I'll when I put out this this video, I'll make sure that NAMI's contact information is included somewhere.
Good. Yeah, because they're terrific.
So those are all of the questions that we have now. A lot of the comments that have come in are just expressing so much thanks for your openness, for both your professionalism and the way that you've presented yourself really as a person, right, as a human being. So thank you, Marci, again, for this wonderful and powerful presentation.
Oh, well, I enjoyed doing it. I did.